So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're excited to be in conversation with you today on this very important topic. What is going on with America's school boards? I'm Dr. Kenann McKenzie, and I'm the director of the Generous Listening and Dialogue Center located in Tisch College. I'm also an elected member of the Beverly School Committee here in Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, we call our school committees the equivalent of the school board, so same entity. First, I want to thank our wonderful co-sponsors for their support, including the Political Science Department and Civic Studies Program, the Education Department, the Tufts Democrats, and Tufts Civic. And we also want to particularly shout out colleagues Steve Cohen, Brian Schaffner, and Peter Levine for their guidance, collaboration, and support. So today's topic is an important one, and as a parent, school committee member, educator, and engaged community member, it's also deeply personal to me. And I know it is for many of you as well. So in recent years, we have seen that school boards have become contentious in public. There have been signs of hostility over whether it's mask mandates, curriculum content, personal expression, student identity. And we've seen disruptions and angry outbursts come in our public settings, which has not really been the norm for our locally elected bodies like school committees and school boards. So they're now attracting national attention. And we've invited guests here today with diverse backgrounds to give us their perspectives on what is going on with our school boards. For the sake of brevity, I will go right to those introductions. We have Brian Reagan, who is the superintendent for Waltham Public Schools here in Massachusetts. He spent over 2 decades in school leadership, serving the community of Bedford as a high school assistant principal, Shrewsbury and Hudson as a high school principal, and most recently, Wilmington as an assistant superintendent. Next, we have Gerard Robinson, who is the Vice President of Education at the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation. He previously served as Commissioner of Education for the state of Florida, Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia, Director and President of the Black Alliance for Educational Options, and as a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. We also are joined by Sarah Reckhow, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Michigan State University, where her research and teaching interests include urban politics, education policy, nonprofits and philanthropy, and racial and ethnic politics. Her newest book is called Outside Money in School Board Elections, the Nationalization of Education Politics. Moderating today's conversation is Tisch College's own Jen McAndrew. Jen serves as the Director of Communications, Strategy, and Planning at Tisch, as well as an elected member of the Melrose School Committee in Massachusetts. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Jen and our panelists. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. McKenzie, for that welcome and for your leadership at Tufts and in your local community of Beverly. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for being with us in this conversation. To our panelists, we're thrilled to have you with us to learn from your experience and your expertise as we discuss the state of school boards in this country today. Let me also thank our co-sponsors as well and the excellent team of Jess Burns and Shanley Daly for their brilliant work organizing this event and all of our events at Tisch College. I'd like to dive in right in with some of my own questions for the panel, and then we'll leave some time at the end of this event for audience members to share their questions with us, both live on screen and in the chat. A through line to our discussion today is really the result of a set of questions that our dean, Dana Cunningham, put forward when we were all thinking about this event. And that's really what is happening at this moment with American school boards. What, if anything, is different right now? And how do we think about those changes in the wider context of building and sustaining a thriving multiracial democracy in this country? So to get us started, my first question is both simple and really big. What is the role of school boards in the United States today? What do they do? And maybe what do they not do? Or what are misconceptions about what they do? And for this first question, let's go in this order. Let's start with Gerard and then move to Sarah and then Brian. Gerard?
Great. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation to join this conversation. So school boards were created to help implement the goals that the state has as relates to K-12 education, also the handoff to higher education. Number two, it's the closest local governmental body that most people in the United States will have an opportunity to touch as relates to the schooling of their children. Third, even when you go back to the founding of school boards, and of course we're talking about Tufts and we're in Massachusetts, you know, your state really played a strong role in setting guidelines for what we can and can't do. And we also talk about school boards in the context of parental rights. And that subject itself is a very old one. In fact, it's older even than the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence. In your state in 1642, the Massachusetts legislature supported a law to say that parents have to play a role in educating their children. 1647, the old Luder States Act talked about parental responsibility. And so as we talk about school boards today and parental rights and where there's friction, where there's partnership, just know that this is a long, ongoing conversation as part of the American experience, and it's not endemic to this time. Often, as I would say, it may be peculiar, but it's not unprecedented.
Thank you for that. Sarah, do you have anything to add here?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. So I think I'll start by just saying, so school boards are the local governing body for school districts. And perhaps serving it up to Brian, who's next, I think one of the most important roles of school boards is the hiring of the superintendent. In many, that's kind of their most important decision, because the superintendent is the person who develops a lot of the policy that guides the district. They propose the budget and the spending plan, and then it's the school board that votes on approving it or sometimes makes amendments or changes. Superintendents propose other measures and policies, boards approve them. Boards tend to be the ones who set the overall direction and goals, and superintendents are the ones who are providing the specific budgetary and policy direction of the district. I think just drawing a little attention to the current moment, I did want to focus on the fact that we have seen school boards making a lot of important decisions in response to COVID in the last couple of years. But one thing I would add to contextualize that is that part of what's happened is that states, in many respects, did not make decisions when they could have in terms of issuing guidance about, say, masking or how to reopen schools in person, remote, or hybrid. And most states left those decisions to local districts. And so there is this interplay between states and local, where sometimes states take a more proactive role that limits local decision-making and governing. But if states choose not to make those decisions, then the locals end up being the ones who are having to make those decisions, including on these very controversial topics that we've been dealing with lately. And I just add that school boards are not really the ones we're talking about the role they don't play. They don't make decisions about what is taught at every grade level in every classroom. A lot of the things we see when we're talking about curriculum is set by state standards. And a lot of the specific guidance on curriculum and pedagogy is coming from specialists who work within the district to make those kinds of decisions. But I'm sure that Brian can add a lot more about these types of points following me.
Thanks, Sarah. It's tough to, it's good to go last because you guys have said so much already, but I think, you know, your point about this, one of the biggest roles of the school committee is to hire and fire the superintendent. That is critical. The other two big buckets I look at, and you touched upon these, were, you know, approving policy and you know, putting that final stamp on the budget. So I think, you know, when I think of this question, in my district, I immediately go to the what they don't do. And I think as a local board here, some of the members struggle with the idea that they don't solve the sort of day-to-day operational issues of a district. And sometimes school committees, who are elected representatives of their community, right, they want to solve these issues as parents come to them about what are largely operational items, and they often overstep. And that's something I've seen in more than just one district. And some of that comes from, I mean, all of that, I should say, comes from a good place. They want to serve their constituents. But the frustration comes when these are items that they just don't have the capacity to manage, and they really should be managed by principals and ultimately the superintendent. So that's something that I think has been heightened during COVID, because the emotions are so high. And if a parent is upset about a masking issue or, you know, something to that effect, they're going to their school committee member and they're asking why, even if it isn't related to a policy piece. And so I've found over the last couple of years anyway, that their inclination to try and calm people's fears and concerns and anxieties, which is a natural thing we do as humans, has gotten in the way sometimes around the real work that we're trying to get them to focus on doing for the district. So that's an interesting dynamic that I think plays out in different ways in different communities. I certainly have seen it play out quite clearly in Waltham. But again, all coming from the right place. It's just, it sometimes can cloud the waters a little and make the superintendent's job even more challenging.
Thank you all for that. Yeah, Brian, I think you're hitting on a real tension that you've all called out, which is that school committee, school board members are often very close to the community, the closest, and at the same time are not necessarily responsible for some of the day-to-day decisions that affect community members and their students and their children. So that tension is always there. So let's move on to talking a little bit about who serves on school committees and school boards, the composition, who's represented, and maybe also who is underrepresented in your view. What voices are missing on school boards and in these conversations? And maybe this time we'll just reverse the order. So Brian, we'll put you back in the hot seat first, and then go to Sarah and then Gerard.
Sure. You know, again, I think of my own experiences in my own committee, and you know, I don't think Waltham is any different than other districts that are extremely diverse. So we've got this, just one point, we have a district that is 44% Latino, and that's the student population. And you can imagine the city mirrors that. And when I say who isn't represented, it's that population on our board is not represented. If you look at the makeup of the committee, it does not reflect the makeup of the city or the school district. I'm not pointing a finger. It's not a fault of anyone, but I think it's the job of the community to make sure that those voices of all citizens are being heard. So Waltham has made some positive moves in the city council in this area, but really need to make a conscious effort, I think, on the school side to get a more diverse representation there. You know, in my experience as an administrator, I've also seen, and this can be helpful, a mix of sort of current parents, which can also be a challenge because you're a parent on a school committee where your children go to school, and that you bring with you, you know, that view. And then I've also worked really well with some retired educators, for example, that have spent years working in public education. They see that as sort of the next step that they can do to give back to their local community in an area that they know really well. And so you know, there are strengths and weaknesses with, you know, with whatever it is that the background is that you bring to the board. But the best committees I've worked with have been ones that have sort of had a variety of those voices around the table, so that it's not just, you know, not that having parents in the committee is all problematic, but if you've got a 7-member committee and they're all current parents, that's a dynamic that can be really challenging in missing sort of the outside perspective. So I'm looking, it's not my decision, but I'm hoping as a superintendent that I have a committee that is not only diverse from a race or ethnicity point of view, but also you know, sort of what they're bringing to the table as experiences that make them, you know, qualified to sit on a board.
Thank you for that. Sarah?
So I think there is an interesting interplay here with the sort of idealistic things we might say about school boards as being these very grassroots and participatory institutions, but kind of building off what Brian is saying, They don't tend to be maybe as representative of the community as maybe that idealistic notion what could suggest. And an important driving feature of this that you'll see in a lot of political science research relates to the elections and electorate for school boards. So school board elections tend to happen in odd years. So off cycle, that's the most typical way that we hold school board elections in the United States. So they're not happening concurrently with the presidential or congressional election cycles. So they'd be happening in 2021 or 2023 when no one's really expecting to go to the voting booth. And so what you see in communities where this is the case is really low voter turnout. I mean, just depressingly low, 20%, 15%, sometimes even lower than that. And so there's been terrific research by a couple of people. Shout out Vlad Kogan at Ohio State University, Sarah Anzia at the University of California, Berkeley. And to sum this up, when you have these odd year elections, what you also tend to see is a really unrepresentative electorate. And by that, what you tend to see is the average voter in these odd year school board elections is a lot older than the average for the full, registered voter population or voter eligible population in the community. And also the electorate tends to be more predominantly white, both than the community and compared to the student population in these districts. And so that with an unrepresentative electorate, that can then fuel, this challenge of representation on the school board itself and who actually gets elected. Another feature of these off-cycle elections and influence, and this comes more from Sarah Anzia's work, is that teachers' unions tend to be especially influential interest groups, especially in the off-cycle elections. Teachers, of course, have a lot of investment and interest in what goes on in the schools, right? I mean, that's where they work, right? So you would expect that. But Sarah Anzia shows that through policy decisions, right, that you can see that influence play out in these districts that have the odd year off-cycle elections. So we have started to see a few places shift on this. A really interesting recent shift was the Los Angeles Unified School District recently shifted to having on-cycle even year elections. So these provide opportunities for us to see, will we see more representative boards or more people running and a more diverse and representative electorate in these communities. But to sum up, it is a tough thing where younger people, Black and Latino residents are underrepresented in a lot of our school board electorates.
One of the great things about school boards is that they are a microcosm of American politics. In many ways, what you see in the teaching force and the leadership force in terms of principals and schools kind of reflects how you look at and the makeup of school boards. But school boards are also unique and they're not all created the same. So for example, the majority of the school board members of the United States are elected, but we also have appointed school board members. Some of my research when I was a student here at UVA focused on why do governors, mayors, and in DC's case, Congress, why do they take over school systems? And you take a look at a place like Washington, DC, Cleveland, or Detroit, where they had a history of having locally elected school board members. Sarah's right. Turnout over time just began to go very low. And so when the community pushed back and said, we don't want you taking over our school system, one of the first things the lawmakers said is, well, guess what? You didn't turn out, we had an opportunity to vote and do this work. And so you have school boards where you still have mayors who are appointing school board members. They tend to pick people who are from the business sector, people from the faith-based sector. Some of them are educators, some of them are military personnel. And so in those instances, you have an opportunity to see people who tell you, listen, I would never run for office for a whole lot of reasons, but I'm willing to serve if I'm going to be appointed because I bypassed the politics of having to run for office, having to go through the process of getting endorsed, as well as raising money to run for school board. So that's one thing to pick up. And then number two, look at the cities who voted to go back to a locally elected board, Boston being an example. I mean, when you think about Boston being taken over in 1991, when it had an elected school board member going back to 1822, there's a case study on how we look, not just at the school board, but the dynamics that shape the political, economic, and social culture that made state lawmakers arrive to a point where they said, maybe we should change the structure of the school board.
Thank you. Yes, it's a very pressing question right around here in the city of Boston right now. Let me pick up on that actually and shift to a question about the political climate right now around school boards. There's a sense, and Kenann mentioned this in her opening comments, that local issues, particularly with regard to schools, are becoming more national or nationalized. The school boards are becoming this sort of nexus of the national political and culture wars, whether that's on issues related to COVID mitigation and masks, or the teaching so-called critical race theory or curriculum, or even what books are being taught in school. And so my question is really two parts. The first part is, do you think this is actually a fair assumption that local school boards are taking on a more national frame right now? And if so, why do you think that that's happening? And let's start with Sarah, in particular, because as we heard, she sort of wrote the book on part of this topic, which was how funding, especially from outside groups, is impacting and contributing to this dynamic. Sarah?
Thanks so much. Yeah, so here's a copy of the book. It is co-authored, so I have two wonderful co-authors, Jeff Hennig and Rebecca Jacobson. And I think just to take a step back, it's interesting to be talking about these hot button current issues because our book is based on research in school board elections from 2008 to 2014. And so in some respects, the issues that we observed in the book kind of predate our current moment, but I think hopefully also shed some light on some contextual features that, you know, help us understand what's going on maybe in the bigger picture beyond the hot button issues of the moment. So we looked at places where there was a growth in campaign contributions coming from out-of-state donors who were often mobilized by advocacy groups to contribute to particular candidates. So we found examples, names that would be familiar to lots of folks like Michael Bloomberg, Sheryl Sandberg, but dozens of people who were giving money to candidates in local school board races outside of their home state where they live. And as I mentioned, the issues at that time are not COVID, not CRT. The driving issues in these elections were predominantly charter schools. And so we saw conflict over charter schools in particular districts associated with large growth in outside money. These included Los Angeles, Indianapolis, New Orleans, and Denver. So these would be districts where the local school board has a lot of power to make important decisions about approving charter schools and the direction of charter school growth in these communities. So even though the issues aren't the same in terms of what we focus on in the book and the current issues concerning nationalization right now, I do think there's some common threads and we can shed some light on this. And yes, I do think it is fair to say that local school boards are taking on a more national frame right now. And so one of the common threads from our research and what's happening today is the role of media and media coverage. Media coverage of local school board elections is very sparse. The media environment in the United States we've been decimating our local media, and we observe it when we do content analysis in the book. And that's still going on and impacting coverage now. And so when something big and controversial comes along, as it did with the instances of outside money in the districts we study in the book, we do see coverage grow. But the coverage overwhelmingly focuses on that one controversial issue at the expense of the more specific, substantive local issues that might be unique to the district and might be really, really important to the students and families in that community. And so the nationalization of media, frankly, is not just impacting school boards, it's impacting our local politics more generally in the US. And then second is that nationalizing dynamics can be polarizing. So with charter schools, we saw candidates feeling like they had to pick a side, that they're adopting sort of more nuanced positions that might be more responsive to the unique dynamics of charter schools in their community, that when we interviewed these candidates, they felt kind of pressured that it was getting harder for them to do that because of the electoral dynamics in their community, both from people who did not want any more charter school growth and from people who wanted to see more charter schools. And I think we're seeing a similar kind of polarizing dynamic take place with these issues right now. And in many respects, with the national donors aren't necessarily connecting with the candidates as individuals. They're looking at endorsements, they're looking at slates of candidates, and again, not necessarily connecting with the unique local issues in those places. And yes, I do see those polarizing pressures playing out for school boards right now.
Thank you for that. Brian, how are you seeing this play out locally in Waltham as well? I know you recently made the local news here around some book challenges that came to the school committee.
Yeah, that's, I was happy to say that it took us that long to get on the local news. So I've seen some of my colleagues, having difficulties much earlier. It was relatively quiet in this community until our elections, which took place in November. And it's the first time we sort of saw, we had this candidate come out of nowhere who we learned later, to Sarah's point, that was being funded by a national organization. She is, has right-wing political views and was coming to meetings and was speaking during public comment about things that really weren't even sort of on the radar for us back in the fall and the winter. Not doing a very good job at putting her point across, but was up there every week, making herself known, and then put herself out there as a candidate. She did not win, but she earned quite a few votes, many more than I think local folks thought she would, which, really I think was a lesson to us to think about, making sure that we have candidates that are stepping up to run for school committee. It was really between her and one other person for that seat, and it was closer than we thought. But after the fact, we sort of learned that she was being funded by an outside group that doesn't even, it's not focused here in Massachusetts. But yes, you mentioned we have 2 books in our high school library that address the LGBTQ plus community. They are books that were well vetted by several associations of school librarians, and they're completely more than appropriate. And they are the only 2 books in our high school library at that time that were specific to that community of students and adults. So it was particularly important for us to do the right thing, in my view, there. And, we reviewed the books. We have a protocol in place, thankfully, what to do when a parent challenges a book. And this parent, by the way, was that same person I mentioned earlier that was running for school committee. And we followed that protocol to the letter, very careful to do that. And the book was ultimately supported. It was found to be sound. It was found to be aligned to the ideals that we had established around picking books for the library. And that, of course, brought a lot of people out to a school committee meeting. The room was packed. There were well over 100 people in the room, and only 2 speaking out loud to ban the books from the library. The rest of the community stood that night, and we were very proud of how they did this, to talk about why these books are important. Since then, we've now raised, through private donors, over $2,500 to add more books to the library that support our LGBTQ plus students. And so that was a particularly stressful and challenging moment, because I wasn't quite sure, back to the idea of school committees, where they were on this issue. I have as I mentioned, a group of committee members that have diverse perspectives. And there were a couple of members I wasn't sure where they'd go. Ultimately, they did, after listening to the community, support our recommendation, which was to keep the books in the library. But it was that was a pretty difficult couple of weeks there, and as you can imagine, we've talked about sort of voice and who's represented. One group I think that we can do better with in Waltham are students. This was an issue that brought students to the forefront, and they spoke eloquently about the need for this type of representation in our collection at the library. And we're really proud of them, and they were not coached through this. They just came on their own and really did well. So I think we need to find ways to get them to be more of a voice on the committee itself. But yeah, so we are starting to, we're starting to see it a little bit. They do occasionally, someone will drop CRT into the mix. There's a lot of social media chatter. But for the most part, compared to some of my colleagues in area communities, it's been relatively manageable so far.
Thank you for that. Gerard, do you want to jump in on this point?
Sure. So yeah, I agree that school board in general has been raised to a nationalized issue. And I look at it through the lens of federal politics because that in many ways influences how we think about local politics. So take, for example, No Child Left Behind. When it became the law of the land, you had local school board members or candidates who were running saying, I'm opposed to it, I'm for it. Now, of course, you had to implement certain aspects of it, but people began to use that as a running point. Fast forward with Common Core. You had candidates who were having an opponent run against her or him, in part because they said they're too Common Core or they're not Common Core enough. And so you found Democrats, Republicans, and independents doing the same thing. We didn't find as much of this with Every Student Succeeds Act. That's for a different set of reasons. But when there was a focus by the Obama administration on supporting and strengthening charter schools, particularly through the federal charter school office, where they provide money, which helps to open up and fund a lot of the early charter schools, there were people who were running saying, hey, I'm not for the role of for-profit charter schools in the mix. I'm not for the role of federal money using this work. And so there's a dynamic of how it's nationalized. I will say pandemic, of course, nationalized it even more, but we can't look at the local dynamic without seeing what Washington's saying and what they're not saying and how that's influencing how people decide to run and who's invited in terms of political PACs. And they play a tremendous role in supporting or going after candidates based upon issues that trickle down from the federal government.
Thank you for that. That's a really important point. And thinking, I have so many questions on all of these different topics we've talked about so far. I'm going to sort of focus in on one, and it's sort of building off a little bit about what Brian was saying. And so let's talk about the parental rights in education legislation in Florida. This bill, which many call the Don't Say Gay bill, limits what educators can teach about sexual orientation and gender identity. And related on this topic of the rights of and support of our LGBTQ plus students, Gerard, I'm going to come to you first on this one as a former commissioner of education in the state of Florida. Particularly interested in what you see as the potential impacts of this legislation and maybe specifically on the students themselves, the support and mental health of students, and also maybe touch on what you think this might mean for school boards.
Sure. So I'd be interested in hearing from the people who call it an anti-gay bill. I actually read the legislation. Word gay appears nowhere in there. It doesn't have to appear in there because we know there are code words and other things that go on. So when I read the law, what I saw in there is they said, if we're going to talk about gender identity and sexual orientation, we're prohibited from teaching that in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. And so what I would ask is in current public schools, health education, I'm not making a correlation between health education, gender identity, and sexual orientation, but when we talk about human sexuality, do we teach that all right now in kindergarten, first grade, third grade? The answer is no, definitely not in the school systems I had a chance to work with. And so I think they are actually going further and saying, if we're going to teach this, these are the grades where they're not going to be taught. Number two, parents do have a right to decide for permission purposes in some states over whether or not I want my child to opt out of this piece. The opt-out option has been in state law for decades. Now, as it relates to students, this law won't do more to help LGBTQ students. This is where local school systems have an opportunity to weigh in and in fact lead where sometimes states can't. And that's to provide a local context into what can happen. So for example, some people call it the bathroom bill here in Virginia, where students sue. Most people have no idea that there were school systems in Virginia already experimenting with this before that issue had come forward. A lot of times states learn from what local school systems, superintendents and school boards are experimenting with. And we at times learn lessons for that. So I think this is an opportunity for that to happen. School board's gonna have a tough time with this one for all the obvious reasons, but one, the law says that after a parent is exhausted his or her opportunity to be heard, it then gets kicked up to the State Department of Education. And then the commissioner can then appoint someone who's a lawyer, who's been in practice for at least 5 years, who knows administrative law. That person will now be involved in the process. After his or her decision is made, is then kicked to the State Board of Education. You've now added a level of state bureaucracy that a lot of my local colleagues say, trust me, there's already enough state oversight. So there are challenges with this bill, bureaucratic and otherwise, but it's going to be a challenge. And I'm sure some school systems will step up to the challenge.
Sarah, Brian, how do you see this type of legislation? We could broaden it to what's happening in other states as well, in Texas, and picking up in particular on this sort of provision that would allow parents to potentially sue their schools or even sort of, report on their educators via hotlines and this sort of thing. What do you think the impact is going to be on teaching and learning and on educators? Do you think they'll be feel limited, stifled? We've certainly heard some of that reported so far in thinking about these bills. And what's your view on what the local angle will be? Sarah, you want to go next?
So I guess the closest thing I've seen here in Michigan is we have a curriculum transparency bill in the legislature right now. That's also gaining a lot of attention. It would be something that would require like posting of lesson plans, curricula at the start of the school year, and is getting a lot of pushback from educators. And so I think if I can maybe draw together some themes here with nationalizing and some of these issues. I mean, we do seem to be seeing an effort by lawmakers in a lot of state legislatures to do legislation that cues into this notion of parents, knowing more or having this, kind of direct I guess transparency or role in terms of their rights vis-a-vis what's taught in schools, or at least that's the framing of the bills. And I think again, tying in with the nationalizing themes, there's a political thing going on here, right? We're coming up onto an election season with a lot of important state elections. And it is galvanizing, certainly, on the conservative side. I know that's part of what's happening here in Michigan with our bill. And so, I think that it just creates potentially more of this dynamic with local school boards of, kind of finding these national framing of these issues with particular labels attached to bills about parents' rights or transparency or things of that nature that may not quite deal with the nuances of what school districts then have to deal with on these issues on the ground. And so I think we're seeing a little more of this cycle playing out with state politics.
Yeah, I won't add much, but I will say sometimes, having spent my whole career in Massachusetts, I feel like I'm somewhat insulated to some of these issues when they come up, and I hear them happening in other states, and I think, how could this be happening? But I do have a general level of worry whenever the legislature gets involved in sort of trying to dictate curriculum. Even if it's something as benign as, trying to pass a civics education bill, which, they did in Massachusetts, that always leads to unfunded, mandates that we now need to put in place and we're responsible for. Take that up from something as maybe benign, or maybe civics isn't benign anymore, but something as benign as civics to something like sexual education, sexuality education, and then it gets even more challenging. I mean, we saw what happened in Virginia, and not that that was the only issue, but, you know, parents' rights around curriculum in schools was something that, you know, helped that candidate, the Governor Youngkin, win. I mean, that was it was a big issue in that particular election. So, you know, I do worry anytime states legislatures tend to get involved in that. What I see on our end, you know, sort of back to what Gerard mentioned, the opt-out piece is always there, but I think that there's nowadays I get the sense from families that there's this assumption that A, that doesn't exist, that's not an option for me to opt out, or B, you're going to stop me from doing that if I try. People are taking that sort of position that I'm going to fight, as opposed to understanding that, of course, this is something you have the right to do, and we will respect that, and here's the procedure, and here's what we do. But on the other side of it, you know, we had something happen locally here where we had a parent who was doing a read aloud for a class, and this parent was on Zoom because of their availability, which is fine. And the parent started reading a book about transgender youth. And was the book appropriate for elementary? I would say in general, yes, it was written for elementary students, but not grade 1. And so that happened in a scenario where we were sort of caught off guard, and now some of that was on us, where the teacher didn't do the vetting that she needed to do around that. But, you know, the way things are right now, that created, it was an instant crisis, because we had to, you know, get into reaction mode and make sure that, you know, families understood what happened and share with them what the book was and explain. And then you've got those families that think this is all part of the plan, that this is what we're trying to do and indoctrinate kids. And so that whole political element of it, that climate, just is always right there. And sometimes I think it makes us almost oversensitive to the issue, and maybe we go too far and we make things worse on our end. So it's always tricky. But it seems to be more of a minefield now than it ever has been in the past. And because if a mistake happens, whether it be ours or parents, there's no room for accepting that someone made a mistake, and that can be really disheartening and frightening to sort of manage on a day-to-day basis. So, but yeah, and just one other thing I would say about the you know, the parental rights and education legislation. You know, I think when it's labeled by another group as "Don't Say Gay" bill, that then elevates it up in the media to perhaps be something that isn't quite what it is. And I think Gerard was you know, spoke of that, and that again comes back to sort of political climate, right? I agree with you, Gerard. We're not teaching these items in K1, 2, or even 3 right now. So if a similar bill came out of the legislature here, it really wouldn't change what we do. But, you know, you would have groups that would label it as something else, and then it creates drama or more of a politicization than is perhaps even really there.
Yeah, I want to follow up on something that Sarah mentioned about politics and agendas, and they're definitely a part of it. But it's not also solely on the right, it's also on the left. So let's take a look last year in the fall, when the National School Board Association put out a letter and referred to parents who were going to meetings behaving in ways surely none of us would find great, and referred to that as domestic terrorism. As of right now, 21 states have actually withdrew their membership from the National School Board Association. 28 states have also said, you know what, we're going to distance ourselves from the process. Currently, 14 attorneys generals are suing the Biden administration, Attorney General, Secretary of Education, because they put in a FOIA request. And they said, after 6 months, we're still waiting to see all the information you say you have on all of these parents gone wild dynamics to see it happen. Now, I can tell you, just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not going on. There's a lot that's going on that we don't see. And I'm sure that no one on this call will support violence against school board members or threats against superintendents. It happens and it's real. But the idea that we can use the term domestic terrorism, and when you look at the 14 attorney generals who are involved, none of them are Democrats. Are we saying that this is not an important issue to the Democrats? Is this an issue maybe where they can do bipartisanship? So the right-left dynamic is something that we have to look at, but just realize the left and the Democrats are doing it as well.
Thank you for that. And I really want to thank you all for your depth and honesty and of your answers. It's been a really fascinating, nuanced discussion, and I'm just really grateful to each of you. We have more questions, but it's 12:47, so we're going to move to some of the audience members who have been waiting to ask you questions. We are going to, I think, elevate a few folks on screen to ask their questions, and Jess and Shanley will help us with that. I think first up is Tufts alumna. Christine, are you ready to go?
Yes, thanks. I was wondering if the panelists think there is enough research on how to be an effective school board member.
Thank you for that, Christine. Anyone want to jump in on that? Sarah, you want to start?
That is such a good question. I think that would be a rich area for some more research. And I do know of a project that was underway that I don't know the exact status of at this moment, but involving some collaboration with the Council of Great City Schools and researchers to work on having board members actually watch the video of local school board meetings from other boards, and essentially kind of code and follow, coding is, kind of for academic research, right? You're tracking, different tones of what's being said and issues that are coming up. And with the idea that you would sort of learn from seeing the dialogue and dynamics from many different boards, and then have an opportunity to reflect on that. And I thought that was both a brilliant idea for learning and a really nice kind of example of potential research practitioner collaboration. And I do think there's a really kind of important role there for some, just like any other profession or service role, right? Kind of professionalization opportunities for boards to learn from one another.
In addition to that, you also have national and local organizations who provide professional development. National School Board Association, they have a lot of practitioner-driven research to show that. You also have CUBE, the Council for Urban Boards of Education. You also have the National Association of Black Educators. Many of them, it's an organization for educators, but a number of them are school board members. When they have a national meeting, either virtual or in person, there's often workshops on school board effectiveness. So there's organizations who provide that from a practitioner perspective to complement the great work that Sarah and her colleagues are doing as well.
I would just add that this is an issue where I think the idea of local control, which is very important in Massachusetts, can end up being a little bit problematic, because I've worked in multiple districts, some where they have an annual session around professional development with Massachusetts Association of School Committees and the board, and they come in and they set expectations and goals and talk about what it means to be an effective member. And then I've been in other districts where that's not welcomed at all. And so in Waltham, that's not been the culture. And we just elected a new member, and I feel for her because she's sort of trying to find her way, as a volunteer on this very important committee. And, she's getting support from her colleagues, but I think to myself how great it would be if we had something that was like other districts where I've worked in. So I think a lot of the answer to this depends on sort of the dynamic and culture of the actual board itself or the chair. In my case, the chair is the mayor of the city, which adds another whole layer of politics to it. So that's just another aspect that I think of when I hear your question, Christine.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I'll just, as a school committee member, I'll just give a little shout out to the Massachusetts Association of School Committees and the great work they do, including in the area of professional development. A lot of those resources are available publicly as well for interested parents and maybe for people who are thinking about running. Martha, I think you're up next.
Yes, thank you. My question relates to, I ran for a school board, the local school board in 2017, where the outside influence of special interest money played a great role in the outcome of that election. And have seen a ratcheting up of campaign money being spent. And so with all this money being spent, really this is about students. So does that translate into improved outcomes or academic performance as the amount of money spent on campaigns increases? What is the impact on student performance in these school districts?
Who wants to take that one? I feel like we're starting all the research questions with Sarah, but you are the political scientist on the panel.
Yes, and I'm afraid to disappoint that I have not answered that specific question, nor do I know anyone who has. It is a great question. We did look at a various, try to trace various outcomes related to outside money in school board elections, but not student achievement. I think. And I will say it would be one of these things from a causal standpoint that would be incredibly difficult to study, because the particular districts that attract outside money are definitely not randomly distributed. They are districts that tend to share certain characteristics. What I can say is, we did find this kind of trade-off on some of, we sort of tried to assess what you might say were sort of the pros and cons of outside money. And I guess I focused more on the cons in my comments about, these issues of polarization, or the issue of media coverage focusing more on the outside money and the hot button issues, and not some of the more locally specific issues getting ignored. But there are some pros. I mean, I think school board elections have, as I mentioned, they tend to be very low visibility. And what you do see with outside money is you see more ability for more campaigning, for more attention, for voters to actually learn more about candidates, because there's money for the campaign to actually get out and reach and contact people. Now in Los Angeles, to be perfectly frank, it's also fueled a cycle of incredibly negative campaigning from both sides in those elections. Just some the mailers that we analyzed from these Los Angeles, they were mainly the independent expenditure groups sending these very, very negative, nasty mailers targeting people on the other side. So there's that, right? And again, it gets at these trade-offs of, well, what does it take to get visibility so people will pay attention and turn out and vote in these local school board elections that, as I said, unfortunately don't get the kind of turnout we would like to see for real strong engagement.
Thank you for that. Trying to get in a couple more questions if we can before the end of our time. Diana is up next. Go right ahead, please.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. I'm Diana Haber-Dawes, a current second-year student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And my question was originally answered. So my original question was, what, if any, professional development opportunities or leadership coaching are offered to school committee members? So thank you for your robust answering, and glad to know that there are these opportunities here across the country, and specifically in Massachusetts. So I recently attended a legislative briefing that was addressing the power gap in superintendencies across the state of Massachusetts specifically. So looking at the lens of professional development and leadership opportunities, what would you like to see for school committee members in terms of acknowledging, perhaps better supporting them in the processes of selecting superintendents, and with an acknowledgement of this disproportionate gap in racial and gender lines? So essentially, how would DEI trainings be, and DEI justice and belonging trainings be offered for school committee members, and what would that look like?
It's a great question. Gerard or Brian, I'm going to give you a chance to jump in.
I'll let the superintendent go first.
Thanks, Gerard. I just speak from this perspective of Massachusetts. Our state association, Mass Association of School Superintendents, is trying to take a front seat position on trying to provide as much as they can in terms of support to increase the diversity of the superintendents across the state, which is vast majority of us are white and white males. So there's a working group that's been doing a lot over the past 2 to 3 years to try and put together information to support, I think, districts and perhaps ultimately school committees. I'm not familiar, I have to admit, with what, if anything, that MASC specifically has done in this arena. I do know they're an outstanding organization, and when they come in and they run school superintendent searches for school committees, because I've been a part of those both on the internal end and then as a candidate, they do work hard with the committee to attract diverse candidates. So that's something that they, I've seen them talking a lot, their consultants talking a lot with committees about, because most districts are looking to diversify their pools of school leaders. And I know that's something that MASC feels is very important. In Waltham in particular, as I mentioned earlier, with 44% Latino community, again, they didn't attract the pool that they wanted, but I know that consultant in particular worked hard to go out and tap the shoulders of candidates of color to encourage them to apply. And I've also had outreach from colleagues who are asking questions, how, do you know somebody? Is there something you can do? Someone that you can, point to that might be interested in our district. So there's some of that networking going on as well, but certainly a lot of work still needing to be done, in order to ensure that our superintendents are as diverse as our state.
So there's a formal approach, and here's one example. So when I was a master's student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in the 90s, one of the professors there was Dr. Bob Peterkin, and he was the leader of the Urban Superintendents Program. One of his students was Dr. Arlene Ackerman, who I worked for when she was superintendent of schools in Washington, D.C. And so Harvard and there are other institutions across the country that have programs in place to not only recruit and educate urban superintendents, but have a focus on diversity. And so there's a formal way schools of education are doing that work, and deans are saying they're going to do more moving ahead. There's also an informal network. So when I worked for Dr. Arlene Ackerman when she was superintendent in DC public schools, she had a network of African-American women who were superintendents, mostly in big cities, who were finding African-American women, particularly, but also men, who were sitting principals or who were in central office, who were in charge of either Title I, Title II programs or something they would get a view. And so there are informal networks that have been a way that people have gotten jobs. I mean, similar to how police, fire persons and others. So they're informal networks. The third is, this is not a new issue. Go back to early 70s and read a book called Black Superintendent, Messiah or Scapegoat. And it's written by a former superintendent who was a professor at one time at Columbia Teachers College, whose title tells you everything you need to know. When you get a superintendent, I'm using Black in this scenario, you're either the Messiah or the scapegoat. Well, you can remove Black today, and I'm sure Brian knows what it's like to be a Messiah or a scapegoat. And it's just tough. And so as we recruit superintendents of color, let's not make the mistake we often do of placing a person of color tax on that superintendent, of saying, you're now the superintendent, but by the way, you gotta deal with the Black stuff, the Asian stuff, Latino stuff, all these dynamics. So let's look at that as well.
Thank you for that. And thank you for all of our audience members who joined us to ask questions. I know we had more in the chat as well. It is already 1 p.m. This hour just absolutely flew by. We did record this conversation and we'll make it available. I just want to thank you all again. Great conversation, so many information-rich answers. And I know how busy each of you is, and I just really, really appreciate you taking this time to be with us, to be with the Tufts University and Tisch College community. And we look forward to staying in touch with you and working with you all in the future. Thank you all for tuning in. Please check our website, tischcollege.tufts.edu/events for more conversations like this throughout the semester and throughout the summer and next year as well. Thank you all. Take care.